What if you built a fighter plane small enough to fit inside another plane? The XF-85 Goblin was an American parasite fighter designed in the late 1940s to be carried inside the bomb bay of a B-36 bomber. When enemy fighters closed in, the Goblin would drop from the bomber, unfold its wings, fight, and then hook itself back onto the mothership using a trapeze system dangling underneath. It was tiny, only 4.5 meters long, and had no landing gear at all, because it was never meant to touch the ground. Test flights proved it could actually fly. The problem was rehooking onto that trapeze mid-air, which turned out to be nearly impossible under real conditions. Only 2 prototypes were ever built, and the whole project was scrapped once air-to-air refueling made it pointless. The Goblin remains one of the only aircraft in history designed to spend its entire operational life attached to another aircraft. Most planes have one fuselage. This one had 2, bolted together. The North American F-82 twin Mustang was exactly what it sounds like, 2 P-51 Mustang fuselages joined at the wing, sharing a single horizontal stabilizer. It was built at the tail end of World War II to give long-range bomber escorts a second pilot who could take over during 12-hour flights across the Pacific. Both cockpits had full flight controls, so either pilot could fly while the other rested, and it actually worked. The twin Mustangs saw combat in the Korean War and scored some of the first American air-to-air kills of that conflict. What made it strange wasn't just the shape, but the fact that it was, quite literally, 2 existing fighters welded together and called a new aircraft. Sometimes a plane becomes a legend before it ever leaves the ground. The Hughes H-4 Hercules, better known as the Spruce Goose, was Howard Hughes' wartime attempt at building a flying boat large enough to carry entire divisions of troops across the Atlantic. Because metal was rationed during the war, the entire aircraft was built from laminated birchwood. It had a wingspan of nearly 100 meters, longer than a modern Boeing 747, and 8 engines mounted along the wings. It remains the largest wooden aircraft ever built, and the largest flying boat in history. It flew exactly once, in 1947, for under a minute at an altitude of roughly 20 meters, then it was rolled into a hangar and never flew again. Hughes spent the rest of his life keeping it in flight-ready condition, pouring millions of dollars a year into a plane that had spent less than 60 seconds of its life in the air. What if a fighter plane took off and landed like a rocket? The Convair XFY Pogo was America's serious attempt at just that. Built in the early 1950s, it stood upright on 4 small legs and launched straight into the sky using a massive contra-rotating propeller. Once airborne, the pilot had to tilt the entire aircraft forward to fly level. Landing meant reversing all of it, flying up beside a landing pad, tilting back to vertical, and slowly descending while craning over one shoulder to see the ground. Only one pilot, test pilot Skip Coleman, ever completed a full flight cycle, and he described the landing as one of the most terrifying things he'd ever done in an aircraft. The program was cancelled once test pilots agreed no combat pilot could reliably land it under fire. It flew, it just couldn't be flown by almost anyone. Sometimes engineers design a plane to be so fast it needs to look like a blade. The Douglas X-3 Stiletto was built in the early 1950s to study sustained supersonic flight, an area of aviation barely explored at the time. To handle the aerodynamic stress, engineers gave it an extremely long, pointed nose, tiny stub wings, and a fuselage so narrow the pilot could barely turn his head inside the cockpit. It looked less like a plane and more like a spear with a canopy bolted on. The catch, by the time it was finished, the engines available were too weak to actually push it to the speeds it was built for. It could barely reach the sound barrier, let alone break it. Still, its shape was so aerodynamically advanced that it directly influenced later supersonic fighters like the F-104 Starfighter. Only one was ever built, and it now sits in a museum. Some planes are built to break records. This one was built to break the atmosphere. The North American X-15 was a rocket-powered aircraft flown by the United States between 1959 and 1968 to test the outer limits of powered flight. It launched from underneath a B-52 bomber at high altitude, fired its rocket engine, and climbed almost straight up. It reached altitudes over 100 kilometers, the official boundary of space, and speeds over 7,000 kilometers per hour, more than 6 times the speed of sound. Some of its pilots officially qualified as astronauts because of how high they flew, including a young test pilot named Neil Armstrong, who flew the X-15 7 times before he ever walked on the moon. At its top speeds, ordinary wings would have burned away, so it looked less like an aircraft and more like a black metal dart with tiny stub wings. Only 3 were ever built, and it remains the fastest crewed aircraft ever flown. Almost every high-speed aircraft has wings that sweep backward. In the 1980s, American company Grumman tried the opposite. The X-29 was an experimental jet with wings angled forward, pointing toward the nose like the head of an arrow. On paper, this made the aircraft more maneuverable and more efficient. In practice, it was so aerodynamically unstable that it would have torn itself apart without constant computer correction. Onboard flight computers were making 40 adjustments per second just to keep it in the air. Cut the computers, and the plane would flip and disintegrate within seconds. 2 were built, and both flew successfully for years, proving the concept worked. But the design never went further, since the mechanical complexity and total reliance on computers made it impractical for real combat use. The X-29 stands as one of the clearest examples of an aircraft that broke the normal rules of aerodynamics purely because there was finally enough computing power to force it to stay airborne. This next aircraft wasn't a helicopter, a plane, or a boat, it was built to be all 3. The Bartini Beriev VVA-14 was a Soviet aircraft from the 1970s designed to hunt American nuclear submarines. It had a small central fuselage flanked by 2 enormous inflatable pontoons, connected by a massive horizontal wing, giving the whole thing the shape of a starfish with a cockpit in the middle. It was meant to take off vertically from the ocean's surface, fly low across open water, land on the sea to launch depth charges, and take off again, all without ever touching land. In reality, the vertical takeoff engines never worked properly and were eventually removed, and the inflatable pontoons were never reliable. The aircraft did fly, but only in conventional horizontal mode, and even then it handled poorly. Only 1 prototype was ever built. When the project was cancelled, the aircraft was sent to the Central Air Force Museum outside Moscow, where it still sits today in open display, slowly rusting. The final entry on this list flew, existed, and was quietly erased from aviation history. In the 1940s, American engineer Vincent Burnelli argued that conventional aircraft design was fundamentally wrong. Instead of a thin fuselage that only carried passengers, with a separate pair of wings doing all the lifting, he believed the entire body of the aircraft should be shaped like an airfoil, every part generating lift. He built several prototypes across a decades-long career, and each one looked less like an airplane and more like a flying wedge with propellers attached. His designs genuinely flew, and tests showed they were more fuel-efficient and safer than conventional aircraft of their era. But major manufacturers never adopted the design, partly for political reasons, and partly because the industry was already committed to conventional layouts. Burnelli died in 1964, having proven his lifting fuselage concept while being largely ignored by the very industry he tried to change. Modern lifting body designs and hybrid wing concepts trace back to what he proved was possible. He's the ghost inside modern aviation, and almost nobody knows his name.